The year was 1942. The skies over Europe burned with fire and steel. The war that had begun on the ground now ruled the heavens. Germany's Luftwaffe was unmatched, a force that had crushed cities and terrified nations. Its pilots, sharp-eyed and ruthless, once dominated the skies over Poland, France, and even Britain. They were the masters of aerial warfare, until the Allies decided to take the fight to the heart of Germany itself. From the airfields of England, hundreds of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose into the cold morning mist. Their mission: destroy the factories, refineries, and railways that fueled Hitler's war machine. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who knew every mission could be their last. The air war over Europe was unlike anything seen before. It was not a battle fought in minutes, but in endless hours of fear, exhaustion, and roaring engines. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped below -40 degrees. Frost formed on oxygen masks. Guns froze, and somewhere out there, German fighters waited, the deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. When the bombers crossed into enemy territory, black puffs of flak filled the sky like a storm of death. The sound of anti-aircraft shells bursting nearby was like tearing metal and thunder combined. The men inside the bombers could only hold their positions, praying that the next explosion wouldn't tear through their plane. The Luftwaffe struck with terrifying precision. Dozens of German fighters would dive from above, their cannons blazing. Tail gunners and waist gunners fired back desperately, tracers streaking across the sky. Sometimes, burning planes fell from formation, silent fireballs tumbling toward the earth. Every hit meant 10 more lives lost. For the American crews, it was a nightmare that repeated itself mission after mission. Without fighter escorts that could reach deep into Germany, the bombers were defenseless once they passed the Rhine River. Many didn't make it home. Some were last seen disappearing into clouds of smoke and flak. Others crash-landed in enemy territory and became prisoners of war. But still, they flew. Every loss fueled their determination. Every fallen crew inspired the next to take off at dawn, knowing full well the odds were against them. The Allies believed that breaking Germany's industrial power from the air could shorten the war. And so, they kept coming wave after wave, day after day. By late 1943, the cost had become unbearable. Entire squadrons vanished on missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. Over 600 bombers were lost in just a few months. Thousands of men never returned. Yet the factories still stood, and the Luftwaffe still ruled the skies. In those dark months, the question haunted every Allied commander. How do we strike the enemy's heart and survive? The answer would soon come in the form of a new kind of aircraft, a fighter that could go the distance, a machine that could protect the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But for now, in the bitter winter of 1943, the skies over Europe belonged to the Germans. The smoke of burning bombers drifted across the fields of France, and the young men of the 8th Air Force looked up at the clouds, wondering if tomorrow's mission would be their last. This was the beginning of the Great Air War over Europe, a battle of endurance, courage, and sacrifice that would shape the fate of nations and decide who ruled the sky. By 1943, the American 8th Air Force had become a symbol of hope and tragedy. Every morning before sunrise, the airfields of England came alive. Engines roared. Crews gathered around their planes, the mighty B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, as ground crews loaded bombs, ammunition, and fuel. Pilots lit cigarettes, trying to hide the tremor in their hands. They had all heard the same grim joke: if you want to finish your tour, pray your number doesn't come up today. The mission board in the operations room read one word that made hearts sink: Germany. Crossing the channel meant crossing into hell. Once airborne, the vast formations stretched for miles, hundreds of bombers glinting in the cold morning sun. From the ground, they looked unstoppable. But the men inside knew better. At 25,000 feet, the cold cut through every layer of clothing. Oxygen masks froze. The thin air made every breath painful. And then the flak began. Black bursts erupted around the formation, shaking the planes violently. The sound was deafening. Sharp explosions followed by the metallic rattle of shrapnel hitting aluminum skin. Each gunner silently counted the seconds between bursts, knowing that the next one could tear their bomber apart. The German defenses were relentless. Anti-aircraft guns tracked the formations from miles away. Cities like Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg were surrounded by walls of flak. Sometimes the sky was so thick with explosions that it looked like a black storm cloud. Pilots had no choice but to fly straight through it, steady, level, and exposed. Then came the fighters. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dived in from the sun, firing cannon shells that ripped through bomber formations. They attacked in waves, darting in and out of the clouds, too fast to follow. Tail gunners shouted warnings through frozen intercoms. The air was filled with tracer fire, red, green, yellow like deadly fireworks. Sometimes a single cannon shell was all it took. A bomber would shudder, burst into flames, and spin downwards, leaving a trail of smoke behind. Crews watched helplessly as friends vanished below the clouds. There were no parachutes, only silence, and then nothing. Each mission was supposed to last a few hours, but for the men aboard, it felt like a lifetime. Every minute brought another explosion, another attack. If they made it to the target, the nightmare wasn't over. They still had to drop their bombs, turn around, and make the long, exposed flight back home. The statistics were brutal. In late 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids, over 60 bombers were lost in a single day. That meant more than 600 men gone. Some burned alive in their planes, others taken prisoner, many never found at all. In the months that followed, casualty rates reached nearly 30% per mission. Few crews completed their required 25 flights, and yet they kept flying. They flew because they believed the war could be ended from the sky. They flew because their friends had died doing the same. They flew because no one else could. Back in England, chaplains walked the empty barracks at night. Spare beds stayed untouched. The laughter that once filled the mess halls was replaced by quiet, and the faint sound of planes landing without their wingmen. Letters were written home, some to mothers, others to sweethearts. Most began with the same words, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it." The bomber crews called it the meat grinder. Every mission into Germany was another turn of the wheel, and no one knew when it would stop. The nightmare wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the helplessness, watching enemy fighters pick apart your formation while your guns jammed from the cold. Hearing your friend's voice fade out over the radio. Smelling the burning oil as smoke filled the cabin. But out of this darkness, a new hope began to form, whispers of a new kind of fighter. One that could stay with the bombers from takeoff to target and all the way back. A plane that could finally end the nightmare. Its name would soon become legend. But before the P-51 Mustang arrived, the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe, and for every bomber crew climbing into their plane before dawn, survival was just a matter of luck and faith. In 1940, before America had even entered the war, the skies over Europe already echoed with destruction. Britain stood alone against the rising storm of Nazi power. The Royal Air Force was fighting desperately to survive, and every day their pilots were being pushed to the limit. They needed more planes, faster, stronger, and capable of matching the German Luftwaffe's deadly Messerschmitt fighters. Across the Atlantic, a young company called North American Aviation received a challenge. The British wanted more fighters, specifically the P-40 Warhawk, but North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold promise. "Give us 120 days," he said, "and we'll design you something better." And so, in a small California hangar, engineers began sketching the blueprint of a new machine, a fighter that would change the course of the war. They called it the NA-73X. Its design was revolutionary. A sleek fuselage, thin laminar flow wings to reduce drag, and a massive radiator scoop under the belly to cool the engine. It looked different, futuristic, almost too advanced for its time. Astonishingly, they built the first prototype in just 117 days. When it took off for the first time in October 1940, test pilots knew immediately this aircraft had potential. It was fast, stable, and beautifully balanced. The British loved its agility and ordered hundreds. The world would soon know it as the Mustang. But there was one problem. The early versions, powered by the American Allison V1710 engine, couldn't perform well at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost power, making it useless for long-range escort missions. The Allies admired its design, but without altitude performance, it couldn't compete with German fighters over Europe. Then fate intervened. A British test pilot named Ronald Harker proposed an idea that would change everything. What if we put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang? At first, even the engineers doubted it. The British Merlin engine was heavy, complex, and designed for Spitfires. But when they finally fitted one into the Mustang's airframe, something incredible happened. The aircraft's personality transformed overnight. With the Merlin engine roaring at full power, the Mustang climbed higher, flew faster, and stayed longer in the air than any fighter before it. It could now reach 440 miles per hour and fight effectively above 30,000 feet. The marriage of American design and British engineering had created a masterpiece. The U.S. Army Air Forces took notice immediately. General Henry Hap Arnold saw the reports and realized this was the answer to their nightmare. A fighter with the range to escort bombers deep into Germany and bring them home again. By late 1943, mass production began. The P-51B and P-51D models rolled off assembly lines in Inglewood, Dallas, and Liverpool. They were armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns and equipped with drop tanks that extended their range beyond 1,600 miles, enough to fly from England to Berlin and back. When the first Mustangs arrived in Europe, bomber crews could hardly believe it. For the first time, they looked out their cockpit windows and saw friendly fighters still with them over enemy territory. The legend of the P-51 had begun. Pilots fell in love with it instantly. They said it flew like it wanted to fight. Its long nose and elegant wings made it graceful, but under that beauty was raw power. The Mustang could dive faster than a Messerschmitt and turn sharper than a Focke-Wulf. In dogfights, it was merciless. In the hands of skilled pilots like George Preddy, Bud Anderson, and Chuck Yeager, the Mustang became a symbol of vengeance, a protector of the bombers and a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. But its birth had not been easy. It was born from desperation, from the need to survive and the courage to innovate. Every rivet, every bolt, every drop of fuel represented the determination of thousands who refused to surrender the skies to tyranny. By the time 1944 arrived, the Mustang was no longer just a plane. It was a promise that freedom could fly farther than fear, and that the nightmare of the bombers would soon end. The world was about to witness something extraordinary. For the first time in the war, Allied bombers would have guardians that could follow them all the way to Berlin and back. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe told a story of total domination. Once, they had echoed with the roar of German engines, the shriek of Messerschmitts, the thunder of Focke-Wulfs. Now, there was only the deep, confident hum of Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, had fallen from the heavens it once ruled. It had not happened overnight. The fall began long before Berlin was surrounded. It began with exhaustion, the kind that creeps in after years of endless battles. The Luftwaffe's best men, the legendary aces of 1939 and 1940, had been lost over England, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. Their replacements were boys, barely trained, often sent into combat with less than 30 hours of flight time. By late 1944, fuel was scarce, parts were missing, and morale was shattered. The German aircraft factories were bombed daily, many reduced to twisted metal. The Luftwaffe could still produce planes, but not pilots, not the kind who could stand against the relentless precision of the P-51 Mustang. The Mustangs now roamed the skies freely, hunting anything that moved: trains, convoys, supply depots, and even German airfields. They struck deep inside the Reich, destroying aircraft before they could even take off. German pilots called it the Black Sky, because once the P-51s arrived, the sunlight vanished behind streams of tracers and burning oil. The fall of the Luftwaffe was as much psychological as it was physical. German crews watched helplessly as American bombers flew in daylight, escorted all the way to their targets and back. There was no hiding, no surprise left. The very idea of air superiority, once Hitler's greatest boast, had become a memory. Inside command bunkers, officers argued and shouted, searching for a miracle. Jet fighters like the Me-262 showed promise, but it was too little, too late. There was no fuel, no experienced pilots, and no time. The Allies ruled the air, and nothing could change that. Meanwhile, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol of something far greater than a machine. To the men who flew it, it was freedom, sleek, fast, and unbreakable. To the bombers it escorted, it was salvation. And to those on the ground below, it was the sound of inevitability. One pilot, Captain Don Gentile, recalled, "We owned the sky. You could see Germany burning for miles. But in that glow, you also felt what war truly cost." The legacy of the Mustang was written not just in victory, but in sacrifice. Many never returned, but every mission, every battle, and every loss pushed the Allies closer to ending the war that had consumed the world. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow. Less than 100 operational fighters remained across the entire country. The mighty air force that had once terrorized Europe had been reduced to silence. After the war, the world looked back and realized that the battle for the skies had changed everything. Air power had become the key to victory, and the P-51 Mustang had proven that technology, courage, and endurance could reshape history. Even decades later, the Mustang's legend endured. Restored and gleaming, they flew again in peaceful skies, their engines roaring not for war, but for remembrance. Veterans wept when they saw them, the same wings that had carried them through fire and fear. The Luftwaffe's fall was a tragedy of arrogance and exhaustion, but it left behind lessons written in smoke and steel. The Allies' triumph in the air showed that no empire, no matter how powerful, could survive when faced with determination and innovation. Today, the Mustang stands as a symbol of that spirit. Its name still echoes in museums, air shows, and history books. It was more than a fighter. It was the instrument that changed the fate of nations. As the sun set over a peaceful Europe, the ghosts of that era faded into the clouds. The men who once fought each other in the skies grew old, but the memory of their courage remained. The P-51 still flies, a silver streak cutting through the air, reminding the world that freedom was once fought for at 20,000 feet above a burning continent. The war in the sky had ended. The Luftwaffe had fallen. But the legacy of the Mustang, the aircraft that gave the Allies their wings would live forever. By early 1944, the war in the air had reached a breaking point. The Allies were losing bombers faster than they could replace them. Each mission deep into Germany was a gamble, hundreds of planes sent across the channel, knowing that half might never return. But everything was about to change. At airfields across England, a new sound filled the cold morning air: the roar of Merlin engines. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. Sleek, powerful, and unlike anything the Germans had faced before, it promised to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Still, one question remained: could it go the distance? The skies over Berlin were nearly 1,650 miles from the bases in England, farther than any Allied fighter had ever flown on a single mission. If the Mustang could make that journey, it would mean the bombers would no longer be alone. Engineers and pilots worked day and night to make it possible. The key lay in a simple but ingenious solution: drop tanks. These were large, external fuel tanks that could be attached under the Mustang's wings. Once empty, they could be released midair, allowing the fighter to continue the mission light and fast. With these tanks and the efficient Merlin engine, the Mustang's range more than doubled. Suddenly, a fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, engage the enemy, and still have enough fuel to return home. It was nothing short of a miracle, the 1,650-mile miracle that would turn the tide of the air war. The first deep escort missions began in March 1944. The men of the 8th Air Force couldn't believe what they were seeing. As their bomber formations crossed into enemy territory, they looked out and saw the silver silhouettes of P-51s still flying alongside them. For the first time, they weren't alone. When the Luftwaffe fighters attacked, the Mustangs turned toward them with fury. What had once been a massacre for the bombers became a slaughter for the enemy. The German pilots couldn't understand how American fighters had made it this far. They believed the Mustangs must have launched from secret airfields inside France. They refused to believe it had come all the way from England. The truth was, the P-51 had changed everything. It could dive faster, climb higher, and fight longer than the German Me-109s and FW-190s. Its 6.50 caliber Browning guns shredded enemy planes from hundreds of yards away. German formations that once attacked with confidence were now forced to defend themselves. In one legendary mission over Berlin, 80 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed in a single day. The Germans called it Black Friday. For the first time, the hunter had become the hunted. Inside their cockpits, Mustang pilots like Bud Anderson, John C. Meyer, and Don Gentile pushed their planes to the limit. They chased enemy fighters across the clouds, protecting the bombers with a fierce sense of brotherhood. Our job, they said, was to bring them home. Even so, the missions were brutal. The Mustangs spent hours in freezing air, their engines screaming, their wings icing over. Pilots often returned with bullet holes in their fuselage, out of fuel, sometimes gliding onto the runway with engines dead. But they had done the impossible. They had gone to Berlin and back. The impact was immediate. Within months, the Luftwaffe's strength collapsed. German fighter losses skyrocketed. Their veteran pilots were gone, and their new recruits stood no chance against the experienced Mustang aces. The bombers, once slaughtered by the hundreds, now struck deep into the heart of Germany with devastating precision. The success of the 1,650-mile Mustang escorts was more than a technological triumph. It was a turning point in the war. It meant that nowhere in Germany was safe anymore. The factories that built tanks, planes, and weapons were burning. The war machine that had terrorized Europe was crumbling from the sky downward. When the first Mustangs landed after those record-breaking missions, ground crews rushed to count the bullet holes and shake the pilots' hands. They had done what no one thought possible. The 1,650-mile range of the P-51 Mustang wasn't just an engineering feat. It was the moment when air power truly conquered distance, when courage met innovation, and when hope returned to the men who flew into hell and back. The miracle had become real, and soon it would carry the war all the way to victory. March 4, 1944. The dawn sky over eastern England glowed a cold, silver gray. Across muddy airfields, engines rumbled to life one by one. It was the morning of a mission unlike any before it, the first time in history that Allied fighters would escort bombers all the way to Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. For months, the plan had seemed impossible. The distance was too great, the Luftwaffe's defenses too strong. But now the P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, and armed for war, had made the impossible real. That morning, nearly 700 B-17 flying fortresses lifted from the runways, bound for the German capital. Their target, the factories and rail yards feeding Hitler's war machine. Above and around them, the Mustangs took formation, their silver wings catching the early light. The long-awaited words came over the radio. "Little friends, you're with us today?" And the reply crackled back. "We're here, all the way to Berlin." The bombers crossed the Dutch coast and headed inland. Below them stretched a landscape scarred by years of war. Smoking towns, broken bridges, blackened fields. The men inside the bombers tightened their flak jackets and checked their guns. They all knew what was waiting ahead. Over Germany, the first black bursts of flak appeared, dark flowers blooming in the sky. The air filled with thunder. Shells exploded dangerously close, ripping through wings and fuselages. But the formations kept going, climbing higher into the thin, freezing air. Then, from above the clouds, the enemy appeared. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s screamed out of the sun, diving straight for the bombers. Their goal was simple: tear the formations apart before they reached Berlin. But this time, the Americans were ready. From behind and above, the P-51 Mustangs dropped into the fight like avenging angels. Their 6.50 caliber guns flashed bright in the thin air, tracers streaking through the clouds. German fighters scattered in confusion. They had never expected escorts this deep inside their own territory. The radio channels filled with shouts and gunfire. "Bandits at 3 o'clock. I've got him. He's going down. Watch your six. He's on you." The battle raged for hours. Over 80 Luftwaffe fighters were destroyed that day. American losses were heavy, but for the first time, the bombers reached Berlin with their escorts still beside them. The German capital lay beneath a haze of smoke and snow. Anti-aircraft guns lined every rooftop. As the bomb bay doors opened, the roar of engines drowned out the chaos. Thousands of bombs fell through the clouds, onto factories, rail yards, and military depots. The ground shook. Berlin, once thought untouchable, was burning. For the German people, the sight of enemy bombers escorted by fighters over their city was shocking. For the Luftwaffe, it was devastating. Their pilots realized that the Americans could now strike anywhere, at any time. The era of German air superiority was over. When the surviving bombers turned for home, the Mustangs stayed with them, every mile, every minute through flak and fire. Many returned low on fuel, engines sputtering, bullet holes peppering their wings. Some didn't make it back, but those who did landed to cheers and tears. The impossible had been done. General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, called it a turning point. "From now on," he said, "we will fight them on their own ground and we will win." For the bomber crews, it was more than a victory, it was deliverance. No longer would they fly alone into the dark. Their little friends, the P-51 pilots, had proven that courage and range could defeat fear and distance. That mission to Berlin marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. In the months that followed, the German Air Force crumbled under relentless Mustang attacks. The hunters had become the hunted, and the skies over Europe were no longer theirs. When the pilots returned to base that evening, exhausted and silent, they knew history had changed. The 1,650-mile miracle had reached its destination, the heart of Berlin. And from that day on, the world understood one truth. Where the Mustang could fly, victory would follow. The morning sky above Berlin was a wall of smoke and thunder. It was March 6, 1944, a day the Germans would never forget. Sirens wailed across the capital as civilians ran for cover, but everyone knew this raid was different. This was no ordinary bombing run. This was the moment when the war came home. At 8 a.m., over 600 American bombers crossed into German airspace, their silver wings glinting in the pale sun. Above them, the guardians of the sky, the P-51 Mustangs, cut through the clouds in tight formation. They were here to finish what had begun weeks earlier, the destruction of Berlin's war industry and the shattering of the Luftwaffe's pride. From airfields outside the city, Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to intercept. The Germans threw everything they had, Me-109s, FW-190s, even experimental Me-410s and rocket-powered Me-163s. It was their last chance to defend the capital. Many of the pilots were barely 20 years old, rushed through training and sent to die in the sky. As the two forces met above Berlin, the air erupted into chaos. The sky was black with smoke, tracer fire, and exploding shells. The roar of engines mixed with the staccato hammer of machine guns. It was not a battle, it was an aerial storm. The Mustangs dove in head-on, slicing through enemy formations. Their .50 caliber guns ripped through German aircraft with deadly precision. Smoke trailed behind falling fighters as parachutes bloomed across the sky. One American pilot later said, "It was like flying through a hurricane made of fire." German commanders on the ground couldn't believe what they were seeing. The enemy fighters had reached Berlin, and they weren't turning back. Radio transmissions were filled with disbelief. They can't have come from England, but they had. The 1,650-mile miracle had made it possible. Inside the bombers, the airmen watched the battle unfold outside their windows. Some cheered as the Mustangs drove the Germans away. Others just stared silently, remembering the countless missions when no one came to help. Now, for the first time, they could drop their bombs over Berlin and still have a chance to return home. Below, the city shook. The bomb load tore through factories, rail yards, and fuel depots. Columns of fire rose thousands of feet into the air. The German capital, once the symbol of Nazi power, was being turned into rubble. The Luftwaffe fought with desperate fury. Veteran aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny led counterattacks, trying to rally their squadrons. But it was too late. Their ranks were filled with inexperienced pilots flying outdated planes. The Mustang pilots were faster, better trained, and backed by overwhelming numbers. By the end of the day, 80 Luftwaffe fighters had been shot down. The Americans lost a handful of planes, but their dominance was clear. The once feared Luftwaffe had been broken. For the young German pilots who survived, the sight of American fighters escorting bombers over Berlin was a symbol of defeat. One recalled years later, "When I saw those silver planes over my city, I knew the war was lost." When the Mustangs and bombers turned back toward England that evening, the sky over Berlin was still burning. Smoke from hundreds of fires rose into the stratosphere, visible even from 200 miles away. The pilots flew home through that crimson haze, exhausted, shaken, but victorious. In the debriefing rooms that night, commanders studied the reports. The losses were staggering, but so were the results. The Luftwaffe's strength had been crippled. Its experienced pilots were gone. From that day forward, Germany would never again control its own skies. The battle over Berlin was not just another mission, it was the end of an era. It marked the moment when the balance of power shifted forever. The Allied airmen who flew that day knew they had seen history unfold before their eyes. For the Mustang pilots, it was the ultimate test of courage and endurance. They had flown deeper, fought harder, and stayed longer than any fighter force before them. And when they returned home, they carried with them the proof that freedom had finally conquered fear. Above the ruins of Berlin, the last echoes of engines faded into the cold evening air. The battle was over, and so was the Luftwaffe's reign. The skies of Europe now belonged to the Allies, and the P-51 Mustang had written its name, forever, in the smoke over Berlin.